What was it about that seized climax wind pump that made a stranger pour out his grandfather's story for 2 hours, then stop just short of the truth? He showed me every oil stain, every hand-carved shim, every year of silent labor etched into the iron, but when I asked why it stopped in 1986, his eyes went hollow and he said he had to go. I bought the pump that afternoon, hauled it to my garage, and spent 3 months taking it apart piece by piece until I found a fist-sized cavity inside the main shaft where something had been deliberately removed. He said his name was Jack, and he was born in 1974 in a house on the edge of Enfield where the city starts to remember it was once fields. His grandfather, Arthur, had a small holding about a mile from the house, tucked behind a row of post-war semis on a lane that most people drove past without noticing. It wasn't a farm exactly. It was 3 acres of awkward land that had somehow survived the 1930s ribbon development, and on it Arthur kept a wind pump that drew water from a well that had been there since before the houses were built. The wind pump was a 1923 Climax, Jack said, or maybe it was a 1924. He couldn't remember exactly, and his grandfather had never been sure either because the plate had been painted over so many times the numbers were just ghosts under green enamel. But it had worked. That was the thing. It had worked every day from 1924 until 1986, and in all that time Arthur had never replaced a single major component. He had greased it. He had painted it. He had replaced the leather on the piston cup twice, maybe 3 times. But the bearings were original. The connecting rod was original. The rotor blades were the same ones that had been turning when Stanley Baldwin was Prime Minister. And then one day in August 1986, it stopped. Jack was 11 years old that summer. He remembered the exact date because it was the day before his school holidays ended, and he had been dreading going back. He had cycled down to his grandfather's place that morning, the way he did every day during the holidays, and he knew something was wrong before he even got off his bike. The wind pump was always the first thing you saw from the lane, the rotor turning against the sky like a metronome that never missed a beat. But that morning it was still. The blades were pointed at 45 degrees, frozen mid-swing, and the tail vane was hanging loose like a broken wing. He found his grandfather in the shed, sitting on an upturned bucket with the piston assembly in his lap. Arthur was 78 that year. He had been a mechanic in the Royal Army Service Corps during the war, had kept 3-ton trucks running on nothing but willpower and baling wire, and Jack had never seen him stumped by a machine. But that morning he was just sitting there, turning the piston over in his hands, looking at it like it had betrayed him. "What happened?" Jack said. Arthur didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know. Here's what Jack told me, and here's where the story starts to get complicated." Arthur had been losing his sight for years by then. Macular degeneration, the doctors said. He could still see shapes and movement, but the fine details had gone fuzzy. He had been greasing the wind pump by feel for the last 3 years, running his hands over the bearings because he couldn't see the grease nipples anymore. And the thing about a machine that old is that it doesn't break all at once. It wears down gradually, unevenly, in ways that a blind man can't see and a proud man won't admit. Jack climbed the tower that afternoon. There were 32 rungs on the ladder, and he had climbed them 100 times before, but never with this feeling in his chest. The rotor hub was about 20 feet up, and when he got there he saw what his grandfather couldn't see. The main bearing had failed. Not the kind of failure where it gets rough and you replace it. The kind where the cage disintegrates and the rollers scatter and the shaft starts cutting into the housing like a knife through butter. There was metal dust everywhere, mixed with grease that had gone stiff and black, and the housing was oval now instead of round. He climbed down and told his grandfather what he had seen. Arthur listened, nodded, and said, "I figured as much." Then he went back to turning the piston over in his hands, and Jack understood that something had shifted between them, something that had nothing to do with bearings or rotors. The neighbor who came to help was a man named Tom Copley, who lived 2 streets over and had a reputation for being able to fix anything. Tom was in his late 50s that year, a former agricultural engineer who had taken early retirement and spent his days tinkering with old tractors and stationary engines. He arrived on a Tuesday morning with a box of tools and a cigarette behind his ear, and he spent 3 hours up on that tower while Jack passed him spanners and Arthur sat in the shed. When Tom came down, he said he could fix it. He said he had a source for replacement bearings, not identical because climax bearings hadn't been made since the 1960s, but close enough with some machining. He said it would take a week. It took 3 weeks. Jack remembered because his school term had started by then and he could only come down to his grandfather's place after classes. Tom was there most afternoons, working on the wind pump, and Arthur was there too, sitting in the shed or standing at the bottom of the tower, looking up at something he couldn't see. When it was done, the wind pump turned again. Jack saw it from the lane, the rotor spinning in the October wind, and he felt something lift in his chest that he hadn't known was heavy. His grandfather stood in the yard, looking up at the turning blades, and he smiled. But here's what Jack didn't know then. Here's what he figured out much later, when he was old enough to understand what he had seen. The housing that was oval from bearing failure would need to be replaced or machined out. A proper repair would have taken the whole unit down, sent it to a machine shop, and fit an oversized bearing with a custom sleeve. Tom Copley had done none of those things. He had cleaned the housing as best he could, packed it with grease, and fitted a bearing that was slightly undersized. Then he had brazed the outer race in place to stop it spinning. That was the repair. A bodge. A fix that would last maybe a year, maybe 2, before the shaft started cutting into the housing again, only this time it would cut faster because the bearing couldn't expand properly. Jack discovered this in 1994, when he was 19 and studying mechanical engineering at a college in North London. He was home for Christmas, and he went to see his grandfather, and he noticed the wind pump was making a noise it had never made before. A grinding noise, low and rhythmic, like something wearing itself out. He climbed the tower for the first time in years, and he saw what Tom Copley had done. The brazing was still there, but the bearing had failed anyway, and the shaft had worn a groove almost 1/4 of an inch deep into the housing. And when Jack pulled that bearing out and saw the braze work, he didn't just see a bad repair, he saw the beginning of a silence he wouldn't understand for another decade. He didn't tell his grandfather. Arthur was 86 by then, nearly blind, and the wind pump was still turning. It made the grinding noise every revolution, but Arthur couldn't hear it the way Jack could, or maybe he could and chose not to say anything. And Jack made a decision that he would spend the next 28 years wondering about. He decided not to fix it. He decided that the wind pump would outlast his grandfather, and that when Arthur was gone, he would come back and do the job properly. Until then, the grinding noise was a secret he carried, and the turning blades were a lie they both agreed to believe. Arthur died in 2002, at the age of 94. Jack inherited the small holding. The wind pump was still turning, still grinding, and by then the groove in the housing was so deep that the shaft was running eccentric. The whole thing wobbled when it turned, and Jack could see the stress cracks spreading from the bolt holes where the tower attached to the base plate. He could have fixed it then. He had the skills, the tools, the money. But he didn't. He told himself he needed to research the correct procedure first. He needed to find original climax specifications. He needed to source period-correct bearings. He needed to document the restoration properly, photograph every stage, treat it like the historical artifact it had become. That research took 22 years. Here's what Jack admitted to me at that estate sale, standing in front of the wind pump that had seized up for good in 2019. He said he had been afraid. Not of the repair work itself, but of what it meant. As long as the wind pump was broken, he could tell himself he was going to fix it. As long as he was researching, he was still the grandson who would make things right. But if he actually fixed it, he would have to face the fact that Tom Copley's bodge had been allowed to stand for 34 years. He would have to face the fact that his grandfather had spent his last years believing in a machine that was slowly destroying itself. Have you ever avoided fixing something because you were afraid of what you'd find, that the person you trusted had been wrong all along? He would have to face the fact that he, Jack, had known the truth since 1994 and had chosen silence. The wind pump seized on a Tuesday in March 2019, on a day so still the leaves barely moved. Jack was inside the house, the one that had been his grandfather's, and he heard the grinding stop. He went outside and watched the blades slow down, one last revolution, and then stop at the same 45-degree angle where they had frozen in 1986. He left them there. He didn't fix it. He researched it. He spent 6 years collecting documentation, tracing the history of the Climax Company, finding original drawings in the archives of the Science Museum. He knew exactly what needed to be done. The housing would need to be line bored and sleeved. The shaft would need to be turned down and straightened. The rotor blades would need to be rebalanced. It was all documented. He had a folder full of notes, quotes from machine shops, diagrams with dimensions written in red ink. He brought the folder to the estate sale, and he showed it to me. It was 2 inches thick, held together with elastic bands, and the paper was soft at the edges from being handled so many times. "That's the research," he said. "And the wind pump?" I asked. He looked over my shoulder at the seized rotor, at the rust forming on the brazing that Tom Copley had done in 1986, at the stress cracks that were now wide enough to see from the ground. "It's still there," he said. "I think I might sell the place. Someone else can fix it." He said it lightly, but his hands were shaking. He was holding the folder against his chest like it was the only thing keeping him upright, and I realized that the wind pump wasn't the only thing that had seized up that day in 2019. Jack was 50 years old when he told me this story. He had spent half his life knowing something that he had never said out loud. Not to his grandfather, not to his mother, not to his wife, not to anyone. The truth about Tom Copley's repair. The truth about his own silence. The truth about the research that was really a way of not doing anything. I asked him if he had ever confronted Tom Copley. He said Tom died in 2001, the year before Arthur. He said he had thought about it, written letters he never sent, rehearsed conversations he never had. He said he had imagined telling Tom that he knew, that he had seen the brazing, that the repair was a lie. But what would that have changed? Tom was 87 when he died. He had done what he thought was best. He had given Arthur 3 more years of hearing the wind pump turn, and maybe that was worth the damage. Maybe that was worth everything. I asked Jack what he thought about when he looked at the wind pump now. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I think about how my grandfather spent his last years believing in something that wasn't true. And I think about how I did the opposite. I spent my whole adult life knowing the truth and doing nothing with it. I don't know which is worse." He sold the small holding later that year. I know because I kept an eye on the listing. The wind pump was mentioned in the property details: vintage wind pump, non-operational, sold as seen. Someone bought the place, a young family who wanted to keep chickens and grow vegetables. I don't know if they fixed the pump or if they tore it down. I don't know if they looked at the folder full of research that Jack left on the kitchen counter, or if they threw it in the bin. But here's what I think about. Jack told me that story at the estate sale, and I listened, and I watched his hands shake. And I thought about the damage that gets done by the good enough repair. The one that defers the proper fix. The one that creates a second failure that's worse than the first, because the first failure was just a machine breaking, but the second failure is a person deciding not to look too closely. You see, the thing about a wind pump that designed to be disposable, mass-produced, cheaply built, meant to be replaced every 15 or 20 years, is that it outlasted everything designed to last, because someone cared for it. Arthur cared for it for 62 years. He greased it by feel when he couldn't see it anymore. He listened to it turn when he couldn't see it. And that care was real. It was the most real thing in his life, Jack said. But the care was based on a lie. And when Jack discovered the lie, he didn't know what to do with it. So he did nothing. And the nothing became its own kind of damage, a second failure worse than the first. It was only years later, standing in front of that seized rotor, that Jack realized the lie wasn't in how Arthur cared for the pump, it was in what the pump had been hiding from the very beginning. Here's what strikes me about this story. The wind pump wasn't the only thing that seized up that day in 2019. Jack seized up too. He had been spinning his wheels for 22 years, doing research that looked like action but was really just a way of staying in place. And when the pump seized, he seized with it. I think about the difference between knowing something and doing something. Jack knew the truth about Tom Copley's repair in 1994. He knew for 25 years. And in all that time, he never once climbed the tower with a proper tool in his hand. He climbed it to look, to photograph, to measure. But never to fix. I asked him why. He said, if I fixed it, I would have to admit that it was broken. And if I admitted it was broken, I would have to admit that I knew it was broken and did nothing. Was Arthur right to let the wind pump stay broken rather than face the painful truth that he had already failed to protect it? And if I admitted that, then the whole thing falls apart. The whole thing. Not just the wind pump. The memory of my grandfather. The story I tell myself about who I am. Everything. He was right, I think. The repair wasn't just about the wind pump. It was about the truth that cost more than the lie. And Jack chose the lie. Not because he was a coward, but because the truth would have destroyed something he wasn't ready to lose. But here's the thing. The truth destroys anyway. It just takes longer when you choose the lie. The last time I saw Jack was at the estate sale. He was packing up his car, a blue Rover that had seen better days, and the folder full of research was on the passenger seat. I asked him if he was going to give it to the new owners. He said, they didn't ask. I thought about that for a long time. They didn't ask. Of course they didn't ask. Why would they? It's just an old wind pump that doesn't work. The folder is just paper. The research is just knowledge that was never used. But I keep coming back to one moment. Jack told me about the day in 1994 when he climbed the tower and saw the brazing. He said he stood on that platform for half an hour, holding the bearing housing in his hands, feeling the groove that the shaft had worn. He said he could have fixed it then. He knew exactly what needed to be done. But he looked down at his grandfather's house, at the smoke rising from the chimney, at the figure sitting in the kitchen window, and he decided not to. He said, I told myself I was protecting him. But I think I was protecting myself. From what? I asked. From being the person who had to tell the truth. Metal remembers. You just have to treat it right. But the memory isn't always what you think it is. Sometimes the metal remembers the failure, not the repair. Sometimes it remembers the bodge, not the fix. And when you finally do the job properly, you have to undo all the damage that was done by the person who came before you, including the damage you did yourself by waiting. The wind pump on that small holding in Enfield is still there, I assume. Or it's gone. I don't know. Jack sold the place and I haven't seen him since. But I think about that folder on the passenger seat. I think about the research that was never used. I think about the man who spent half his life preparing to do something he never did. And I wonder how many of us are doing the same thing. Not about a wind pump. About something else. Something we saw once, years ago, and decided not to look at too closely. Something we're still researching, still documenting, still preparing to fix. What is it for you? What's the one thing you saw and didn't say? What's the repair you've been researching for 20 years? I don't need to know. But maybe you do. Jack never fixed the wind pump. He never told his grandfather the truth. He never confronted Tom Copley. He never did any of the things he spent his life preparing to do. And the folder full of research is probably in a landfill now, or in a second-hand shop, or sitting on a shelf in someone's garage where it will be found in 50 years by someone who wonders what it means. But here's what I think. I think Jack told me the story because he wanted someone to know. He wanted there to be a witness. Not to his research, not to his expertise, but to his failure. He wanted someone to stand there and listen and nod and say, "I understand." And I did. I understood. Not because I've fixed a wind pump, but because I've done the same thing. I've known something was broken and I've walked past it. I've researched the fix and I've never applied it. I've chosen the lie because the truth was too heavy. The folder was 2 inches thick. The elastic bands were stretched loose. The paper was soft at the edges. And the wind pump was still seized, still frozen at 45 degrees, still pointing at the sky like a question no one could answer. Metal remembers. But so do we. And the memory doesn't go away just because you stop climbing the tower. That frozen rotor at 45 degrees, would you have climbed the tower to fix it or let it rust? If this story made you feel the weight of an unfinished repair, that is what the like button is for. If you are the kind of person who still thinks about a broken thing you never fixed, this channel is your quiet corner.